Okay, for today's lesson, we will be looking at the types of ecosystem services, the four main types that are within your textbook content itself. Okay, so when we're looking at this is a follow-up to what ecosystem services are, which we covered in the previous lesson. So, very quick recap: when we're looking at ecosystem services, we refer basically to the benefits brought about by nature to people. Okay, so these services generally they're produced by both the living and non-living environments in the ecosystem, and they tend to be critical for our survival, and they will benefit us, okay, if we have a healthy and thriving natural environment around us. So there are four main ecosystem services that the environment can provide. Okay, they are categorized into these four key categories. Now, these categories, once again, I believe I've mentioned this before, are key geographical terms. So when you are doing answering and you are trying to identify a type of ecosystem services, it's essential that you not only give us your four or whichever one you're identifying, but provide the exact term. So it's provisioning ecosystem services, regulating ecosystem services, cultural ecosystem services, as well as supporting ecosystem services. So if you do encounter a command word that is identified, we will require and we will demand that you give us the exact terminology here. So in terms of provisioning ecosystem services, what actually are we looking at? We are looking at the tangible resources, right, that you can obtain from nature around you. Things like food, water, and even resources like wood. Okay, so if you are going to look at it, food actually will be one of the most important provisioning services that nature can provide for us. Okay, now how do we actually get it? Is it only through scavenging in the forest itself? No, when you're looking at provision of food as a provisioning ecosystem service, you also need to include things collected through activities like agriculture as well as fisheries. Okay, so it's not only your hunting and gathering. Okay, so in the modern world, actually, if you are providing things like ample space for farming, for fishery, right? These are all considered provisioning ecosystem services. Okay, they can also be found in any urban neighborhood itself, right? So within the urban neighborhood ecosystem, you can also find provisioning services. Now, I believe in the earlier parts we actually looked at things like community gardens. Okay, community gardens are one very common type of provisioning services that is within the everyday life of the sphere that we live in, especially those of us who live in HDB housing. However, there is an example here that I want to cite, right? Now, this particular farm, okay, it's a car park rooftop farm, and it's not the one in Ang Mo Kio which you've seen previously. This one is actually in Tampines, right? So this gentleman here, this 35-year-old, actually started a vegetable farm on top of a car park rooftop in Tampines, and it's pretty successful. It's able to harvest 16,000 packets of vegetables a month. Okay, it's a modern form of provisioning ecosystem service. Now, bear in mind when you are looking at the content itself, right? Especially if you're looking at the textbook, it may seem that angle is that you're providing this for yourself. It's like a subsistence kind of consumption where I do some sort of planting and then I harvest it and it's for my own consumption. This is not necessarily true. Okay, so when you're talking about provision of ecosystem services, it can be provided in the forms of somebody engages in the activity of providing this. Okay, and you enjoy the benefit of having fresh vegetables to purchase, right? Having the benefit of exchanging the money you get from your labor into, okay, this food that is provided by other vendors, okay, or farmers in this particular case. Okay, so keep this in mind. Right, the second one that we'll be looking at is, of course, this one here, regulating services. Okay, regulating ecosystem services, what are we looking out for then? Okay, so basically, these are the things that help the regulation of various other ecosystem processes. Okay, things like how does it help regulate your climate? How does it regulate maybe things like a flood regulation, or even disease outbreak regulation. Okay, so these are things that you are hoping to regulate with these ecosystem processes in place, right? Now, they tend to not work on their own, they tend to work together because ecosystems are interlinked. Okay, I hope by this moment in time you have a sort of a rough understanding that these ecosystems are not they do not function in isolation. They're interlinked. Their functions, their ability to clean and sustain and be sustainable, and they're actually rather resilient to change as well once it's rooted already. So in an urban environment, right, when you're looking at some of these regulating ecosystem services, you could be looking at things like microclimate regulation, flood mitigation, even air quality control. Okay, so once again, when you're looking at this particular area here, right, your textbook actually gives you a few very, very good examples. Okay, in terms of regulating the local climate, let's take a look at an image that is typical of Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park here. Now, in this image here of Bishan Ang Mo Kio Park, what do we see? We see a very, very large tree. Okay, and it's not the only tree in the area. Okay, on a pretty much large scale, you can find all these all over in Bishan Park. Now, what kind of function can these can these trees do in terms of regulating local climate? So think about it, when you have such large amounts of trees, right? It can actually help to lower your surface temperature. It can also provide some shade to the residents in the area, right? On a larger scale, if you have like if you move further to the north of Bishan Park, right next to it, you have your central catchment area where you have some of these very large rainforest areas. Now they can also, on top of providing shade and cooling the area, right, they actually can trigger rainfall. Therefore, we call them the central catchment area. So, what is this area we're looking at? We're basically concerned with the areas that contain your reservoirs like Macritchie, Upper and Lower Pierce, and Seletar Reservoir. So the vegetation, the nature reserve around these reservoirs, they actually form this regulating ecosystem service of regulating the local climate for you. Okay, in using Bishan Park still as an example, if you look at in terms of regulating water flows, right? So what does Bishan Park have actually? Bishan Park has this very interesting converted river, which actually was the monsoon drain. So if you follow me through this portion here, I will show you where the monsoon drain actually is. So this area that I'm highlighting, oh, this is unsuccessful. Right, this area that I'm highlighting here in red, well, let's use blue then. Okay, in blue, this is actually where the river is. Okay, with a tributary that links here. Right, where does this tributary come from? It comes from actually surface runoff water that is from the estates in the background in Bishan. So these, right, the surface runoff, they go into underground pipes and they go flow in, and they flow into the water at Bishan Park, right? And so with this in mind, looking at where this park actually is, I can tell you pretty firmly that the water flows this way. Okay, with the tributary coming down, flows this way. So what does this water actually do? It actually, with this surface runoff regulation, right, it helps regulate your water flow in the general area. So why would we want to regulate water flow? Because we don't want to suffer from flooding. So when you have such vegetation, it's not only the fact that you have rivers, but also these areas where I'm highlighting in yellow. Right? All these areas, these are your soil, right? So there's infiltration, there's permeate water that permeates whenever it rains, and all these vegetation over here also help to capture some of the water and some of the rainfall, therefore reducing further the risk of flooding. So this is what we're looking at when we are talking about regulating water flows, I'm sorry. Now finally, right, we come back to this image of the trees again. So when you look at the large amount of trees in the environment, let's link back to about two sections earlier in this topic itself, where we talk about function of trees. What can actually trees do for the air quality? Right, trees have a unique ability to regulate air quality. They can help you remove some of the pollutants in the atmosphere when they do their transpiration. So that is another thing that these parks and these kind of natural areas can help in terms of functioning as a regulating ecosystem service. So keep this in mind, right? Bishan Park is a very useful example. It's somewhere where a lot of us actually have experience going to. If not, maybe this coming June holidays, you could try to go Bishan Park for a day trip, right? And take a look at what exactly is around, whether we're trying to smoke you or giving you fake news. and maybe you will gain a better appreciation of how all these ecosystem services can be found in Bishan Park itself, right? Next, the third one, the third ecosystem service we're looking at is actually cultural ecosystem services. Now, these are then where we're looking at the intangible benefits that we get from these ecosystems. Okay, things like aesthetic experience, educational opportunities, and even recreational activities, right? So it can be in terms of how we use the area in to maintain a certain level of physical health, and also think about what we talk about in terms of the gardens, right? Gardens that you have that promote mental health and mental well-being. Okay, so some of these natural spaces also, because of heritage and proximity, they develop a sense of place because of maybe it's somewhere where you walk past very often, some place where you have spent very good memories, or even a very bad memory with a family on a particular trip to this location. Okay, so if you have unique enough of an opportunity, you may even have a chance of developing this into a tourist or a site of scenic beauty where people have aesthetic appreciation of the place, right? So this you can find in your textbook itself. I will not belabor the point. I would rather like to then show you an example of what we mean, right? So Bukit Timah Nature Reserve is one of these sites that residents go. Okay, they engage in recreational activities. For example, I think some of you actually have done this before. You might have gone hiking in Bukit Timah, right? Some of you have actually been to this place maybe in primary school as part of your learning journey where you go and then you learn about nature, learn about the native species that can be found in the rainforest in this original area here. And if you visited this service center, you may have seen the tiger specimen within the visitor center here, right? So that's educational opportunities. Okay, sometimes if some job students may even come here and conduct some field work, things like soil sampling or microclimate data collection, like measuring the difference in temperature between at the base and all the way at the summit of Bukit Timah Nature Reserve, right? So residents in this area, then what do they enjoy, right? So if you remember, we talked about it being aesthetically pleasing, right? Why? Because this is a place of great natural beauty, right? This is a forest, a nature reserve forest, so it is kept in this very pleasant state for large periods of time. Okay, so Bukit Timah Nature Reserve is one good example that you can cite if you're looking at cultural ecosystem services within urban areas like Singapore. Okay, now finally, the final one that I want to touch on briefly will be supporting services. Okay, these are then the services that are essential for production of all other ecosystems. They are like the glue that pulls everything together. Okay, so when you're looking at these kind of supporting systems, what are we looking at? We're looking at microsystems, like how soil is formed, soil formation, how plants continue to grow and propagate. Is it through pollination? Is it through, yeah, how is it done? Okay, and how do the plants survive in the first place? Is it through photosynthesis? So these concepts that you have covered previously in primary school, as well as some of them in your lower secondary science syllabus, right? These are your supporting ecosystem services, right? Now the role of them is to come together and maintain the general area in its livable state so that humans and other animals and plant life can survive. Okay, so I'll give you an example. Like if you're doing photosynthesis, right? Plants can absorb the carbon dioxide, you release oxygen, and then what does this do in terms of providing support? This maintains the oxygen content in Earth's atmosphere. Correct. So it's through photosynthesis that the oxygen content is maintained. And what does that do for us? We need oxygen to survive. Plants need oxygen to survive. Animals need oxygen to survive. So this in a more indirect manner, also ensures that all other ecosystem services can function. So this is what we're looking at when we're looking at supporting ecosystem services. So it can be something as simple as this, right? Your bee pollinating your flower. What is the end result of this successful pollination? You need to remember that with successful pollination, you will get a fruit, right? The fruit can then be eaten by an animal, okay? You and I, right? A human being. And because we don't eat the seeds, we toss the seed away, like every bad human being who litters everywhere you go, right? And then when you litter that little seed that falls onto the ground is allowed to then germinate on the ground and become a new plant, right? I'm not saying littering is good, but this is actually in nature, in the original intent of things. This is how the cycle actually works. Now, of course, if you didn't pick up that fruit and you didn't eat it, a monkey ate it or a civet cat ate it, you would have devoured the entire fruit. Okay, and what will happen to the seed? It will have come out with a ready source of fertilizers. Right, when you defecate, when the animal defecates the seed out, the seed is never digested. So when it comes out, it's already encased in a pile of natural fertilizers, and then it's able to then kickstart the process of building more support systems. So with that, we've come to the end of your four ecosystem services for main types. And to wrap up, there is actually a very short uh, question, a short exercise, right? A short 3-mark exercise that I will be issuing via your teams. Okay, so uh, complete the exercise and get it submitted through your geography rep into the pigeonhole. Okay, so thank you very much. Please proceed to do the exercise.